This is the audio-only version of the podcast. To watch the video and get more details and show notes, go to paancestors.com. This is Denise Allen with PA Ancestors, and we have Dr. William Roulston joining this week, and he's going to talk about his book, Researching Scots-Irish Ancestors. This book first published in 2005 and then updated, this is the second edition, has a plethora, a whole assortment of resources that you will want to check out, both on the history side to understand why people came here to America from the Ulster part of Ireland, but also the record sets that you need when you're over in Ireland, either virtually or in person, to figure out, are these my people that I found here in Pennsylvania? But the Ulster Irish also went to several other places up and down the East Coast. So if you're not from Pennsylvania, you can still listen to this episode and learn about Ulster Irish immigration. So without further ado, here's Dr. William Roulston with Researching Scots-Irish Ancestors. I am really thrilled to have William Roulston on the podcast. He has written a book which has been recommended to genealogists over and over and over again for people that are researching those early, somewhat pesky for us, Irish ancestors to America. The book is, this is the second edition, Researching Scots-Irish Ancestors, also called Researching Ulster Irish Ancestors, if you buy it in the UK. And it is a whopping 600 pages of excellence. William, welcome to the podcast. I'm thrilled that you're here to tell us about your book and teach us a little bit about what brought all these Scots-Irish or Ulster Irish to America. 1600 to 1800, immigration out of Ulster, Ireland. This is a big question. What were the major drivers that drove people out of Ulster? Why did they leave their homes and take rides of 6-10 weeks or more on ships out all over up and down the coast of America?
Okay, well, it's a great pleasure to be with you, Denise, and thank you for inviting me on. So we can really see the beginnings of migration from the northern province of Ireland, Ulster, to America from the late 17th century onwards. We even go back to the 1680s. We do see an outflow of migrants from the northern ports of Ireland to places such as Delaware, Maryland, and so on. So that's particularly associated with the northwest of the island. So Donegal and joining parts of counties Tyrone and Londonderry, and the flow really coming out through the port of Derry itself. So we have figures such as Francis McKeamy, who was born in North Donegal and who emigrated to America about 1683, and who's regarded as the father of American Presbyterianism. He was instrumental in establishing the Presbyterian Church along the eastern seaboard. So we move into the 18th century. What we find is that throughout the 18th century, there are various surges in immigration. There are peaks and troughs of immigration. And if you look at the overall pattern, you can see how closely they are related to periods of economic hardship, maybe periods of famine, of dearth, of inclement weather, harvest failures, and so on. So the economic driver was certainly hugely important in encouraging people to think, well, will I stay here in the northern part of Ireland, or will I go across the Atlantic? And obviously it was a major step to sell up and go out, because the great majority of these early migrants never, ever came back to Ireland. Going to America really was, something there's no turning back. Once you'd made that decision, once you'd stepped on the boat, that was really it. Now, accompanying the economic factors in immigration, we also see the religious situation for nonconformists in Ireland. Now, in the 18th century and well into the 19th century, the established or state church in Ireland was the Church of Ireland, an Episcopalian church. The great majority of the people in Ireland were not members of it. And even in Ulster, the established church only enjoyed the support of a minority of the population. For Catholics and for Presbyterians and for others like Quakers, they did not owe allegiance to the Church of Ireland. However, they were still forced to accept it as the dominant religious body. If we're thinking of the position for Presbyterians and remembering that while Presbyterians were certainly not the only religious grouping to leave Ireland in this period, for a long period, they were certainly the dominant element in that migration. So for Presbyterians, for example, thanks to legislation of 1704, Presbyterians could not hold public office in Ireland. They were disbarred from that. To hold public office in Ireland, you had to produce a certificate to show that you'd taken communion in the Church of Ireland Church. This was known as the Test Act. The Presbyterians also found themselves that their marriages were not considered valid, and so the children of those marriages were not regarded as legitimate. And so for these and for other reasons, Presbyterians did feel estranged from, you could say, the levers of power in Ireland, and were more inclined to seek a new life with greater religious freedom in America. Now, when it comes to the factors, you might say the religious factor, the economic factor, it's not as if people are weighing up in their minds, right, these are religious reasons I could maybe go, these are the economic reasons. It was all sort of bound up. They saw the world through, the one lens, you could say. So economic factors, religious factors, other factors were all part of the one worldview that they had. So certainly when we look at the period, we think of the late 1710s, and there we see a major outflow of migration from North Ulster to not simply to New England, but it's very much associated with New England to Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maine. We also see migration in some numbers into Pennsylvania as well, and that continues increasingly so that eventually Pennsylvania does become the epicenter of migration from Ulster to America.
Yeah, I was doing some reading yesterday, and that it's estimated at the time of our revolution in 1776 that a third of the population of Pennsylvania was Ulster-Irish. So, I mean, phenomenal numbers. So we're talking, of course, we didn't do our first census, actual official count of people until 1790 as a country. And at that point, Pennsylvania had 400,000 residents. So, maybe 100,000 of the people that lived here by 1776 were Ulster-Irish, which is a phenomenal number because they might have been, it sounds like first generation, maybe second generation, here. And came, as you said, not very wealthy. So many indentured themselves in order to pay for their passage. Is that correct?
It is, yes. So let's just take Pennsylvania for a moment. So yes, the immigrants from Ireland were beginning to arrive in Pennsylvania, certainly from the late 17th century. Many of the earliest migrants from Ireland were actually Quakers, not maybe surprising given Pennsylvania's history. So there was certainly a migration of Irish, many of whom came from the northern part of Ireland to Pennsylvania from the end of the 17th century onwards. In terms of the overall numbers, well, nobody really knows. Estimates range from as low as 60,000 to as high as 250,000 migrants from Ulster going to America in this period. So if we even take a figure roughly in between, say, even 100 to 120,000, that still is a very substantial flow of people across the Atlantic. Some of the immigrants went over, you might say, under their own steam. They paid their own passage. They maybe were able to sell whatever they possessed in Ireland. If they were farmers, they could sell off their livestock and their farm holdings. They could actually maybe, there's something in phenomenon, particularly associated with Ulster, where a farmer could sell his farm to the farmer. Now, it wasn't an outright sale because at this time farmers were tenants. They didn't own their land outright. They were tenants on an estate, so they paid a landlord an annual rent for their farm. But they had this idea that they had tenant rights, so they could sell the right to occupy their farm to an incomer, and that also helped to pay the passage to America and to help set themselves up when they arrived in the New World. But as well as those who paid their own passage, a very high proportion of immigrants were either indentured servants or redemptioners. So people who either indentured themselves, so worked for a certain number of years to pay their passage, or people who on their arrival in America would have someone pay the passage for them. So as you know, so you had a mixture of the means by which people crossed the Atlantic, from those who paid their own passage themselves to those who had to pay their passage or find the money to pay their passage some other way. And yes, unfortunately, there are no lists of passengers boarding a ship in Ireland and then arriving, sailing across America for the 18th century. So for the vast majority of immigrants, the overwhelming majority, we have simply no information at all about their passage. In a few instances, the passengers on a ship may well have written a statement in which they express their thanks to the captain of the ship for his good conduct towards them, how he cared for them, looked after them. And that may have been published in a newspaper in America and then picked up and published again in a newspaper in Ireland. So the Belfast Newsletter, which began publication in 1737, includes a number, not a huge number, but certainly a number of these expressions of thanks from the passengers to their captain, which may include a list of names of at least a proportion of the passengers on the ship. So you do find those, from the late 1760s, 1770s, which do at least give us an idea of who was on those particular ships, but they still represent only a small minority of those who actually crossed the Atlantic in this period from Ireland.
Okay. And if we wanted to follow up, I guess if we're trying to match up these tenants who might have sold their rights, would there be records of those sales or that transfer?
No, it was
Okay.
it was largely an informal arrangement, actually.
Okay.
Occasionally, you may find in estate correspondence the letters back and forth between the landlord and his agents, maybe discussions about tenants who were planning to do this,
Okay.
and maybe the sanction of the landlord was needed before it could happen. But no, largely these were really informal, verbal arrangements, and sadly, there are no records of those.
Okay. Yeah, on our end, the indenture contracts vary too, so it becomes also as difficult. So in your book of researching Scots-Irish ancestors, the one record set, you go through all the record sets that we as genealogists can use in Ulster, in Northern Ireland, to research our ancestors. But the one record set I was surprised about, the one group, was Moravians. So the head of the Moravian church, the headquarters is here in Pennsylvania, and I always thought of Moravians as being German. Like I just assume they're all German speakers, So they had an Irish group too?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Through, I suppose you could say, missionary endeavor, and particularly the work of a man called John Cennick or Kennick, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but Cennick. The Moravians established a presence in Ireland in the mid 1700s, and only about three miles or so from where I am now, there is a Moravian settlement called Grace Hill in County Antrim, and it was established in the mid 18th century. It's a planned village. It's laid out around a central square with a school and a church and buildings around it. And behind the church, set slightly back from the church, is a long rectangular graveyard with a path running down the center of it. And on one side, men are buried, and on the other side, women are buried. Now, I'm not sure if that is a practice found in Moravian churchyards, cemeteries in Pennsylvania. It's not the standard practice for Moravian cemeteries in Ireland, even. There are other Moravian graveyards and they don't follow that practice, but it is certainly a highly unusual phenomenon. So, yes, well, within the Moravian settlement, there were a proportion of people of Central European background. People from, you can see if you look at the headstones, you'll see people who were born in Saxony and so on. But you might say local people from the Grace Hill area were also joining the Moravian Church. And Moravians are fantastic record keepers. Oh, yeah. Their records in Ireland are superb. There are two religious groups in Ireland that keep absolutely superb records, Moravians and Quakers. So if anybody does have a Moravian or a Quaker ancestor, the chances are they could find out a huge amount of information about them through church records, through records kept by those churches.
Okay. Yeah, that just really blew my mind. I saw Moravians and it kind of made sense. Maybe if you were part of the Moravian faith or at least interested in it, you might have landed in Pennsylvania because you knew, you might have heard it was more of an option here than Maryland was a Catholic colony for a long time and then kicked the Catholics out. There was some other drama going on around us, around Pennsylvania at the time. So I'm just going to ask you about this one Irish thing. So as an American, when we think about Irish history, it feels like there's like regular rebellions, that occur and they get a little confusing, at least for us. So I never know how serious it is. So the 1798 rebellion, like how influential was that? Was that like a huge immigration push out of the country, or was this more of an internal matter?
Yeah. Well, it did certainly impact upon immigration from Ireland. Providing a little bit of background to it, in 1791, the Society of United Irishmen was founded in Belfast, and by mainly middle-class Presbyterians. Soon afterwards, other branches of the United Irishmen were founded in Dublin and other places. So initially, they were campaigning for parliamentary reform and an end to outside interference in Irish affairs. In other words, the interference of the Westminster Parliament in Irish affairs. So remembering that in 1791, the only people who could vote were Protestant men who possessed a freehold, and a freehold was, for electoral purposes, the possession of a lease for lives, so a lease that would not expire until certain individuals named on that lease had died. So only Protestant men over 21 for freehold. So Catholics were excluded from being able to vote. Presbyterians were never specifically banned from voting in county elections, parliamentary elections. However, the elite, the MPs, the lords, were almost exclusively members of the Church of Ireland, which again, as I said, represented only a minority, even a minority within the Protestant population in Ulster. So for a variety of reasons, Presbyterians and Catholics felt excluded. Now, the United Irishman was not exclusively Presbyterian. It had Catholic members, even had some Church of Ireland, a proportion of its membership as well. So the government was concerned about what its intentions were and took actions to suppress it. So the United Irishman really reorganized itself as a more revolutionary movement. They looked to revolutionary France for assistance. Now, the rebellion itself began in Ulster in early June 1798. It began in Leinster, province of Leinster in the south of Ireland in late May 1798. It began in Ulster in June 1798, but really it lasted for only a little over a week. There were some initial United Irish successes, but eventually the rebellion was crushed, and the United Irishmen were defeated by the you might say the government forces. It did result in immigration at different stages. So there was a proportion of people who emigrated before 1798, people who were maybe suspected of involvement in the Irishman, who decided, well, it's better that I get out before I'm arrested and maybe even hanged. In the immediate aftermath of the rebellion, there were others who fled to America, some who'd actually been involved in the battles, who'd actually been out in arms, decided they'd be better to go. Others were banished, so they were simply given the choice: you have to leave Ireland by this date, or else, you will be incarcerated. And then in the years after that, after the rebellion, some who maybe just couldn't settle, couldn't adjust, also decided that they would be better to emigrate to America. So you might say you see different phases in the immigration around the 1798 period, some directly as a result of the rebellion, some before, and some in its following years. So Pennsylvania was a very popular destination for people from Ulster. We think of several Covenanters, for example, from the area in which I'm living now. So the minister of the Covenanter congregation in Cullybackey, the Reverend William Gibson, two of his young licentiates, or young students for the ministry, John Black from Port Glenone and Samuel Brown Wiley from just north of Cullybackey. They fled in 1797 to America. They had been implicated in the rebellion, and they decided it would be better to leave for America before being arrested. And who knows, they could have been put to death.
This is just so wild.
Yeah.
It's so wild to me. Like, you just think the government's coming after you and you just get on a ship and leave,
Yes. Well, I mean, there are all sorts of stories about people who were, carried, the slob lands of Lough Foyle to a waiting boat, and then taken out to a sailing ship, and then going across to Philadelphia or whatever, or people hidden in barrels, and so on. So there are some really fascinating stories of how people managed to get out at that time.
I wonder too if that explains why sometimes we have a hard time on our end finding records of where people came from. They might have wanted to cover that up, cover their tracks a little bit and not be too explicit, just head out, separate themselves from maybe too many connections to home that weren't safe to have, get out of the cities and live with some like-minded folks in the middle of nowhere of Pennsylvania versus maybe risk getting arrested or shipped back or, harmed in some way. Yeah. From somebody who sympathized with the Irish government at the time or the English government,
Well, I think there was very little chance of them being sent back. Actually, I think they
one-way trip. They didn't want them back.
Yeah. Well, they did settle. Now, some, of course, vanish, disappear, keep low, but others went on to become fairly prominent in, politics and in other ways, and business and so on in America. We think of the likes of Patrick Kerr Rogers, who was from Omagh, who left for America because of his alleged involvement in the United Irishman, who became a very prominent educator, and whose son, William Barton Rogers, was the founder of MIT.
Ah, there you go. Yeah. That's not slacking off at all. That's pretty, pretty big deal. So is there anything else about the book that you want to let people know about? This is the second edition. The second edition was updated in 2018. What else would you like people to know about the book? And this gets recommended to genealogists in America because you not only explain the various record sets that exist that that aren't like ours. Obviously, we can make some comparisons, but you actually give a methodology on how to research it. So start here. You want to make sure you have this in line before you approach this record set, because a lot of us are so used to typing in the search box and just getting an answer, and we can't do that in this case. We're not just searching names. So what else do people need to know about the book and in terms of
doing
the research?
I suppose, first of all, I would emphasize that no one should buy the book thinking that they now will definitely, absolutely find their ancestors without. It is very much a guide to sources, and I discuss the availability of records. I discuss where they may be found. It's very much focused on records still in the archives rather than records that can be found online. So I focus a great deal on estate papers, the records of these landed estates, bearing in mind what I've said already about farmers did not own their land, they were tenants. So the records relating to the management of these estates form a really vast archive of material, and they are particularly good for the province of Ulster, at least for parts of the province of Ulster. Now, of course, again, I emphasize, you're not always going to find an ancestor in a landed estate collection, but over the years, I have seen people make real breakthroughs in their research through landed estate papers, maybe even in a few instances getting right back into the 1600s through estate papers. So I devote quite a bit of space in the book to discussing those records and also to listing them in as much detail as. So I've got 100 pages of records on estates for all 9 counties of the province of Ulster. I also, in the new edition, discuss the issue of emigration and records relating to immigration. So I've said already that there are no official lists of passengers from the 18th century. However, you can find information on your ancestors potentially through other sources. So maybe even through church records, for instance. You might find information on your ancestors emigrating through newspapers. You might find, a proportion of people who emigrated to America, or not emigrated, who traveled to America in the 18th century, did so as prisoners. They were transportation. People were sent as prisoners to America. Now that ended with, of course, the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War. Then from 1791, criminals were transported to Australia from Ireland, but a proportion went out as convicts to America. So there are, a range of different sources. If you're going through estate papers, you may, for instance, find a rental for the lands in an estate, and there may even be a comment written on one side, emigrated to America, potentially emigrated to America. So I suppose what I'd emphasize is it's important to try to look at the totality of records for the area in which you believe your ancestors came from. So look at the church records, and don't be restricting yourself. Well, I'm only going to look at Presbyterian records. No, if they exist, look at all the records available for that locality. Look at all the land records available for that. Find out what else is available. Through the book, I include a parish by parish summary for all 9 counties of Ulster of the records that are available, whether church records, estate records, or just miscellaneous obscure records, just an obscure listing of names from a particular source drawn up for some reason now lost in the mists of time. So it's a sort of thing that I hope people will find helpful to them in just getting to grips with the broad range of sources that are out there. Research in the 18th century is not easy. Some people will struggle, some people will not be successful, sadly. That's just the nature of genealogy. But at least it gives them something to get hold of and see what the potential is, what at least is the potential. And really, until you start looking, you don't know what you'll find.
Isn't that the truth? You really do have to just start looking. And you've provided a really comprehensive, it almost operates like a checklist, that we can make sure we have checked everywhere and use your methods. Is there anything the Ulster Historical Foundation has coming up this winter, given it looks like we could be going through another winter of COVID lockdowns and things being online, which I'm not complaining about the online part at all, because that's been wonderful. So anything coming up that genealogists here in America could take advantage of that you're doing on your side of the pond?
Yes, well, in response to COVID, we have moved some of our courses online. We used to do in-person courses, but sadly, that's not an option right now. So if you check out our website, ancestryireland.com, You can find a listing of the courses that we offer. So, for instance, we offer a detailed course on Irish genealogy, over the last 4 centuries. There's something like 28 hours of lectures. And we also include within a series of workshops or Q&A sessions. So people can come on to Zoom and can actually ask us questions directly about their research. And my colleagues, Fintan and Gillian and myself, are there to help answer questions from people as part of our genealogy courses or online genealogy courses. So certainly check out our website to see what we have lined up over the autumn and winter months.
Okay, perfect. I will include that link in the show notes and encourage people to go there, because I know we'll be looking for things to do this winter again, so we can stay, we'll be at home. And William, I wanted to thank you for being on the podcast. I wanted to really thank you for writing this book and then updating it so I can still buy it, because sometimes there's great books and they go out of print and then we can't find them, or they're super expensive. But thank you for keeping this updated for us. I'm looking forward to diving in. I have my Curry family that I know is from Ulster, and way too common of a name. If I run across one more John or William Curry, I'm going to be tearing my hair out, but I'm sure a lot of genealogists feel the same. So I hope you stay safe and through all this, and we get to connect again in 2022.
Yes, and thank you very much. It's lovely to speak to you this afternoon.